Sarah had always been the kind of person who trusted easily. Living in a small town where everyone knew everyone, she believed that honesty was the foundation of the community. That's why, on an unusually bright and crisp autumn morning, she didn't think twice about taking her car to Mike's auto repair shop. It was the go-to place for most locals, and Mike, the shop's owner, had a reputation for being friendly and approachable, at least on the surface. Her car, a silver sedan that had seen better days, had started making a strange grinding noise. Sarah assumed it was something simple, like worn-out brake pads. With her busy schedule as a single mother to her precocious 8-year-old daughter, Emma, she needed the repair done quickly and efficiently. Mike's shop seemed like the logical choice. As she pulled into the lot, the smell of oil and rubber greeted her, along with the sound of air compressors and clinking tools. Mike himself came out, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag, flashing a wide grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "What brings you in today, Sarah?" he asked, leaning casually against the car. Sarah explained the issue, and Mike nodded knowingly, his eyes scanning the car like a predator sizing up its prey. "Sounds like the brakes," he said. "Could be a simple fix, but I'll need to run a diagnostic to be sure." "Don't worry, I'll take good care of you." Something in his tone made Sarah's stomach twist, but she brushed it off. She handed over her keys and walked to the small waiting area. The room was cluttered with outdated magazines and smelled faintly of coffee and motor oil. As she sat down, she couldn't help but notice a young couple leaving the shop, their faces a mix of frustration and resignation. She overheard snippets of their conversation. "Told me it was just an oil change, but now it's a transmission issue. How does that even happen?" The woman said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I don't know," the man replied. "But we don't really have a choice. The car's already torn apart." Sarah felt a pang of unease. She shook it off, telling herself she was being paranoid. About 20 minutes later, Mike reappeared, his expression serious. "Well, Sarah, it's a good thing you brought it in. It's not just the brakes. You've got some wear on your rotors, and the suspension is looking rough. Honestly, I wouldn't recommend driving this car until it's all fixed." Sarah blinked, taken aback. "Suspension? That's strange. I haven't noticed any issues with the ride." Mike shrugged. "Sometimes these things sneak up on you. But don't worry, I'll give you a good deal. You're looking at about $1,800 total. I can get started today and have it done by tomorrow." The figure hit her like a punch to the gut. 1,800. That can't be right. I just came in for brakes. Mike's smile turned slightly condescending. "I get it. It's a lot. But trust me, you don't want to ignore these problems. I've seen too many people put this stuff off and end up with a totaled car." Sarah's mind raced. $1,800 was more than half her monthly income. She didn't have that kind of money lying around. "Can I think about it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mike's expression hardened, but he quickly recovered, nodding. "Of course. Just let me know soon. The longer you wait, the worse it'll get." Sarah left the shop feeling uneasy, her mind replaying the interaction. Something didn't sit right. She decided to call her friend Lisa, a no-nonsense accountant who had a knack for sniffing out dishonesty. Lisa listened intently as Sarah recounted the conversation. "Something's fishy," Lisa said. "Brakes and rotors, sure, but suspension. That's a big leap. And $1,800. That sounds like a classic upsell." Sarah sighed. "What do I do? I can't afford that, but I don't want to risk my car breaking down." "Get a second opinion," Lisa advised. "There's a shop on Main Street, Rod's Auto. He's honest and doesn't overcharge. Take it there." The next morning, Sarah drove her car to Rod's Auto, her heart pounding with anxiety. Rod, a gruff but kind older man, listened carefully as she explained her situation. He promised to take a look and call her with an estimate. Later that afternoon, Sarah's phone rang. "Good news and bad news," Rod said. The bad news is your brakes and rotors do need replacing. The good news is your suspension is fine. Whoever told you otherwise was trying to fleece you." Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you sure?" "Positive. The total for brakes and rotors will be $400, parts and labor included." Relief flooded through her, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Mike had tried to scam her, plain and simple. Sarah thanked Rod and hung up, her mind racing. She wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when she suspected other people might also be falling victim to Mike's shady practices. That evening, after putting Emma to bed, Sarah dove into research. She read article after article about common car repair scams and how to recognize them. She found forums where people shared horror stories of being overcharged or missiled by dishonest mechanics. The more she read, the angrier she became. Mike wasn't just taking advantage of her. He was preying on people's lack of knowledge and trust. Determined to act, Sarah started digging deeper. She joined a local community group on social media and posted about her experience. Careful not to name names. Within hours, the comments started rolling in. Dozens of people shared similar stories of being overcharged or pressured into unnecessary repairs at Mike's shop. One comment stood out. "He tried the same thing with me last month. Charged me for an engine diagnostic I didn't ask for. When I questioned it, he said it was standard procedure. Total scam artist." Sarah's suspicions were confirmed. Mike wasn't just a bad mechanic, he was running a racket. But what could she do? She didn't have the money or resources to take legal action, and simply warning others didn't feel like enough. She wanted accountability. The next day, Sarah returned to Mike's shop, armed with her newfound knowledge. Her heart pounded as she walked through the door, clutching a folder of printouts detailing her research and estimates from Rod's Auto. Mike greeted her with his usual grin, but it faltered when he saw the determined look on her face. "Sarah, back so soon? Ready to get started on those repairs?" "No," she said firmly, "but I am ready to talk about this." She placed the folder on the counter and began pulling out papers. "Here's an estimate from another mechanic, confirming that my suspension is fine. And here are dozens of comments from people who've had similar experiences at your shop." Mike's face darkened. "I don't know what you're trying to pull, but—" "I'm not pulling anything," Sarah interrupted. "You are, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." As she spoke, other customers in the waiting area began to take notice. Murmurs spread through the room as they glanced at Sarah's papers and whispered to each other. Mike's confidence wavered, but he quickly put on a defensive front. "Look, maybe there was a misunderstanding," he said, raising his hands. "I'll knock some money off the bill. How about that?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm not interested in a discount. I'm interested in you doing honest business." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick. Then one of the customers stepped forward. "You know, he tried to pull the same stunt with me last week. Said my alternator was shot when it wasn't." Another chimed in. "Same here. Charged me for an oil change I didn't need." The floodgates opened, and one by one, customers began sharing their stories. Mike's face turned red, and he stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. The truth was out, and Sarah had sparked a reckoning. Though she left the shop that day without further confrontation, Sarah knew this was only the beginning. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The confrontation at Mike's shop lingered in Sarah's mind long after she left. As she drove home, her hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel. Her thoughts churned with a mix of frustration, determination, and a faint hint of unease. She had made her stand, but Mike's dismissive attitude and the vague threat in his tone still gnawed at her. It wasn't enough to confront him. She had to ensure that his predatory practices didn't continue to harm others in her community. The next morning, after dropping Emma off at school, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, but her mind buzzed with activity. She had one goal: to dig deeper and uncover just how far Mike's schemes extended. If he had been operating this way for years, there was bound to be a trail of disgruntled customers and questionable practices. Sarah began by researching reviews of Mike's auto repair shop. At first glance, the ratings were mixed, some glowing, others scathing. But as she sifted through the reviews, a pattern began to emerge. Customers praised the shop for minor repairs like oil changes or tire rotations, but when it came to more significant work, the complaints piled up. Words like overcharge, unnecessary repairs, and scam appeared frequently. One reviewer mentioned being charged $500 for a battery replacement, while another described being pressured into replacing an entire exhaust system for triple the average cost. Her heart sank as she realized how many people had likely been taken advantage of. Mike's confidence wasn't just arrogance, it was the assurance of someone who had gotten away with his schemes for far too long. Sarah's next step was to join a few local social media groups where residents shared recommendations, warnings, and general community chatter. She posted a carefully worded message describing her experience at Mike's shop, avoiding direct accusations but expressing her concerns. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, the post had dozens of comments and shares. People recounted their own run-ins with Mike, some as recent as a week ago, others stretching back years. One woman named Carol shared how Mike had convinced her to replace her timing belt urgently, only for another mechanic to later tell her it had been in perfect condition. A young man, Jake, described being charged $1,200 for a complete diagnostic and tune-up when all he needed was a new spark plug. Among the comments, a few people defended Mike, claiming he had always treated them fairly. But the majority painted a damning picture of a man who thrived on exploiting the trust of his customers. Sarah's unease deepened as she realized just how many people had suffered in silence, either too embarrassed or too defeated to fight back. She knew she had to take action, but the question was, how? That evening, Sarah reached out to Lisa again. They'd met at a local coffee shop where Sarah shared everything she had uncovered. Lisa listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This isn't just a bad mechanic," Lisa said finally. "This is a pattern of fraud. He's making a living off of deceiving people." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice heavy with frustration. "But what can I do? I don't have the money for a lawyer. And even if I did, it's not like I have solid proof." Lisa sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "What if you gathered evidence? Recordings, invoices, anything that shows a clear pattern. If you can document enough cases, you might be able to take it to the authorities, or at least warn people more effectively." The idea planted itself firmly in Sarah's mind. Over the next few days, she threw herself into the task of gathering evidence. She started by reaching out to people who had commented on her post, asking if they would be willing to share their stories. To her surprise, many were eager to help. Some sent her copies of invoices, highlighting the questionable charges. Others recounted their experiences in detail, describing how Mike had pressured them into unnecessary repairs. One story stood out. A retired mechanic named George had taken his car to Mike's shop a few months earlier as a test after hearing rumors of shady practices. George had deliberately sabotaged a small part of his car, a disconnected wire in the ignition system, and brought it to Mike for a diagnosis. According to George, Mike had claimed the car needed a new alternator and a battery, quoting a price of $1,500. George had laughed in his face and walked out, but he hadn't reported the incident. People like Mike rely on the fact that most folks don't know much about cars, George told Sarah over the phone. They throw around technical terms to confuse you and make you feel like you don't have a choice. With George's story and the growing pile of evidence, Sarah felt more determined than ever. She decided to take Lisa's advice and record her interactions with Mike. It was risky, but she knew it was the only way to expose him. She borrowed a small audio recorder from a friend and prepared to return to Mike's shop under the guise of seeking clarification on her original invoice. The next day, Sarah walked into the shop with a calm she didn't entirely feel. The recorder was tucked discreetly into her jacket pocket, its tiny light hidden by a fold of fabric. Mike greeted her with his usual smirk, though there was a flicker of wariness in his eyes. "Back again, Sarah. What can I do for you?" "I've been thinking about our last conversation," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "I want to make sure I understand everything before I move forward." Mike's smirk widened, and he launched into an explanation of the repairs he had recommended. As he spoke, Sarah pressed for details, asking why the suspension needed replacing and what specific issues he had found. The more he talked, the more apparent it became that he was spinning a web of half-truths and outright lies. He used jargon to obscure the facts, throwing in phrases like critical wear and structural integrity, without ever providing concrete evidence. At one point, Sarah asked to see the parts he claimed were damaged. Mike hesitated before mumbling something about disposing of them already, a blatant contradiction to what he had said during their last conversation. The recorder captured every word, and Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing she was building a solid case. But the most damning moment came when Mike, sensing her hesitation, leaned in conspiratorially and said, "Look, I'm doing you a favor here. Most shops would charge you double for this kind of work. If you don't get it fixed soon, you're going to end up paying a lot more down the line." Sarah forced a smile and thanked him for his time before leaving the shop. As she drove away, her hands trembling slightly on the wheel, she felt a mix of triumph and disbelief. She had caught him red-handed, his arrogance and deceit laid bare, but she knew this was just the beginning. That evening, Sarah reviewed the recording, making careful notes of key moments. She shared the audio with Lisa, who was equally appalled. Together, they began crafting a plan to escalate the situation. Sarah reached out to the local news station, sharing her story and the evidence she had gathered. A reporter named Elena expressed immediate interest, agreeing to meet with Sarah to discuss the possibility of an expose. When they met at a quiet cafe, Elena listened intently as Sarah outlined everything she had uncovered. The reporter's eyes widened as she heard the recording, her pen flying across her notebook. "This is big," Elena said. "If we can corroborate this with other victims, we can expose him. But we'll need more than just your story." Sarah nodded, already prepared. She handed Elena a folder containing the invoices, statements, and messages she had collected. It was a damning compilation, each piece of evidence a nail in the coffin of Mike's fraudulent empire. Over the next week, Elena worked tirelessly, interviewing other victims and piecing together the story. Sarah, meanwhile, continued to gather more evidence, reaching out to anyone willing to share their experiences. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Mike's schemes extended far beyond what Sarah had initially suspected. He wasn't just preying on individuals, he was exploiting the trust of an entire community. As the pieces fell into place, Sarah felt a growing sense of hope. For the first time, it seemed possible that Mike might finally be held accountable for his actions. But she also knew that the battle was far from over. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but Sarah was ready. She had started as just another victim, but now she was a force to be reckoned with. The buzz surrounding Sarah's crusade against Mike's auto repair shop grew louder with each passing day. Word of her efforts began to spread beyond the small social media groups she had first turned to. Local residents whispered about the woman who had dared to take on the town's most notorious mechanic, and curiosity swirled around what might happen next. But for Sarah, this wasn't about attention or revenge. It was about justice. She wanted to ensure no one else would fall victim to Mike's predatory practices. After her meeting with Elena, the reporter from the local news station, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Elena had assured her that the story would gain traction, but they needed to build an airtight case before going public. That meant gathering even more evidence and, if possible, catching Mike in the act one last time. Sarah's first step was to enlist more help. She reached out to George, the retired mechanic who had shared his experience of exposing Mike's lies. When she called him, George's gruff voice softened as he listened to her plan. He agreed to meet her at a diner the next morning to discuss how he could help. The diner was bustling with the morning crowd when Sarah arrived. George was already there, nursing a cup of coffee and scanning the newspaper. He looked up as she approached, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Morning," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "You're causing quite a stir, you know. People around town are starting to talk." "That's the idea," Sarah replied with a small smile. "But I need more than talk. I need to make sure Mike doesn't get away with this." George nodded, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about what you said. If we want to nail him, we need undeniable proof. Something that'll force the authorities to act." Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Do you think we could set him up? I mean, take a car in for a fake problem and see what he says." George's eyes twinkled with mischief. "That's exactly what I had in mind. I've got an old truck sitting in my garage. Runs perfectly fine. But I could rig something minor. Something any honest mechanic would spot and fix for cheap. If Mike claims it's a major issue, we'll have him." They spent the next hour hashing out the details. George would prepare his truck and install a small dash camera to capture everything. Sarah would accompany him to the shop, posing as a concerned friend who didn't know much about cars. Together, they would bait Mike into revealing his true colors. By the end of their meeting, Sarah felt a surge of confidence. She was no longer fighting this battle alone. George's expertise and willingness to help gave her hope that they could finally bring Mike to justice. Over the next few days, George prepared the truck. He carefully disconnected a single spark plug wire, an issue that any competent mechanic would recognize immediately. The truck would run a bit rough, but it was a simple fix that shouldn't cost more than $50. Meanwhile, Sarah worked on gathering more testimonies from other victims. Every story she collected added weight to her case, painting a picture of a man who had spent years profiting off deceit. The day of the sting operation arrived, and Sarah's nerves were on edge as she and George drove to Mike's shop. The dash camera was hidden behind the rearview mirror, its lens aimed squarely at the driver's seat. George had tested it several times to ensure it would capture clear audio and video. As they pulled into the shop's lot, Sarah glanced at George. "You ready for this?" "More than ready," he replied, his tone calm and steady. "Let's see what this guy's made of." They parked the truck and walked into the shop, where Mike was lounging behind the counter. He looked up as they entered, his face breaking into a practiced smile. "Well, if it isn't Sarah," he said, his tone dripping with false cheer. "Back again. What can I do for you?" Sarah forced a polite smile. "This is my friend George. He's been having some trouble with his truck, and I told him you might be able to help." Mike's eyes flicked to George, sizing him up. "Sure thing. What seems to be the problem?" George played his part perfectly, describing the truck's rough idle and slight hesitation when accelerating. Mike nodded, already exuding an air of authority. "Sounds like it could be a misfire. Let me take a look." He motioned for them to wait in the small seating area while he pulled the truck into the garage. Sarah and George exchanged a knowing glance as they sat down, the hum of the shop's machinery filling the air. Minutes turned into an hour, and Sarah's patience began to wear thin. Finally, Mike returned, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression was grave, the kind of look that could make an unsuspecting customer panic. "Well, it's worse than I thought," he said, addressing George. "Your ignition system's shot, the spark plugs, the wires, maybe even the coil pack. And that's just the beginning. I'd also recommend replacing the fuel injectors and running a full diagnostic to make sure there aren't any other underlying issues." George raised an eyebrow, feigning concern. "How much are we talking?" Mike hesitated, as if calculating the maximum amount he could charge without scaring them off. "You're looking at about $2,000, give or take. But I can get started today and have it done by tomorrow." Sarah felt a surge of anger, but kept her expression neutral. George, ever the professional, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "That's quite the bill. Are you sure all that's necessary?" Mike's smile tightened. "Trust me, if you don't take care of this now, you'll be looking at a much bigger problem down the line. I've been doing this for years. I know what I'm talking about." George nodded slowly. "I'll think about it. Thanks for taking a look." Mike's demeanor shifted, irritation flickering across his face. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." As they left the shop, Sarah could barely contain her frustration. $2,000 for a disconnected spark plug wire, she muttered. "Unbelievable." George chuckled. "We got him. Let's get that footage to Elena." That evening, they reviewed the dash camera footage, which had captured every word of Mike's diagnosis. The evidence was damning, a clear demonstration of his willingness to deceive and overcharge customers. Sarah sent the video to Elena, who promised to include it in her upcoming expose. In the meantime, Sarah continued to rally support from the community. She organized a meeting at the local library, inviting anyone who had been affected by Mike's scams to come forward. The turnout was larger than she expected. Nearly 24 people showed up, each with their own story to tell. As Sarah listened to their experiences, a sense of camaraderie began to form. These weren't just individual victims. They were a collective voice, united in their desire for justice. Together, they decided to file a formal complaint with the state's Consumer Protection Agency, attaching copies of their invoices and a link to the dash camera footage. By the time Elena's expose aired on the local news, the town was buzzing with anticipation. The segment was hard-hitting, featuring interviews with victims, excerpts from the dash camera footage, and an analysis of Mike's billing practices by an independent expert. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Customers began canceling their appointments, and Mike's once thriving business was thrust into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. But Sarah knew the fight wasn't over. While the expose was a significant victory, she wanted to ensure lasting change. She and George began working with local officials to push for stricter regulations on auto repair shops, advocating for better consumer protections and transparency. Through it all, Sarah felt a growing sense of pride. She had started this journey as an ordinary woman, but she had become a force for change. And as she stood before a crowd at a community meeting, sharing her story and encouraging others to stand up for what was right, she realized that this was just the beginning. Together, they were stronger, and together, they would ensure that justice prevailed. The morning after Elena's expose aired, the small town was alive with whispers. In diners, grocery stores, and workplaces, people discussed the shocking revelations about Mike's auto repair shop. For years, he had operated under a guise of trustworthiness, his smile and affable demeanor masking a calculated scheme to defraud unsuspecting customers. Now, thanks to Sarah's determination, his empire of deceit was crumbling. Sarah, however, wasn't basking in the triumph. As she sipped her coffee that morning, the phone on her kitchen counter buzzed incessantly with messages and calls from friends, acquaintances, and even strangers. Most were messages of support and gratitude. But a few were wary, warning her that Mike wouldn't take this lying down. Her resolve was firm, but a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Exposing Mike publicly had felt like a victory, but it had also painted a target on her back. She didn't regret her actions. If anything, she felt more determined than ever. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this battle wasn't over. Around midday, Sarah's suspicions were confirmed when she received a call from Elena. The reporter's voice was calm, but carried an edge of urgency. "Sarah, I just got word that Mike's hired a lawyer. They're claiming defamation and threatening legal action against the station, and you personally." The news hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Defamation. But everything we said was true. We have evidence. "I know," Elena reassured her, "and the station's legal team is confident we'll come out on top. But I wanted you to hear it from me before it hits the news." Sarah thanked her and hung up, her mind racing. She knew Mike would try to retaliate, but the idea of being dragged into a legal battle was daunting. She wasn't wealthy or particularly well-connected. Her strength lay in her integrity and the support of her community. Still, She couldn't let fear stop her now. If Mike wanted a fight, she'd be ready. Later that afternoon, Sarah met with Lisa and George at a quiet park to discuss their next steps. The autumn leaves crunched underfoot as they walked, the air crisp and cool. Lisa, ever the pragmatist, had already begun researching similar cases and compiling legal resources. George, meanwhile, was focused on rallying public support. "This isn't just about you, Sarah," George said as they sat on a bench overlooking the lake. "This is about everyone he scammed. If he thinks he can intimidate you into backing down, he's got another thing coming." Lisa nodded. "We need to double down. Let's organize a town meeting and invite everyone who's been affected. The more voices we have, the harder it'll be for him to play the victim." Sarah hesitated. "Do you think people will show up?" "Some might be too afraid to speak out." "They'll show up," George said firmly. "You've already inspired them. They just need a little push." The three of them spent the next week organizing the meeting. They booked a space at the community center and spread the word through social media, flyers, and word of mouth. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to document everything: every invoice, every message, every recorded interaction with Mike. She knew that if this went to court, she would need an ironclad case. When the night of the meeting arrived, Sarah was overwhelmed by the turnout. The room was packed with people of all ages, some standing along the walls because there weren't enough chairs. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of anger, determination, and solidarity. As Sarah stepped up to the podium, she felt a wave of nervousness. Public speaking wasn't her forte, but she knew this moment was too important to shy away from. Taking a deep breath, she began. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "When I first walked into Mike's shop, I had no idea I was stepping into a fight that would bring all of us here tonight. But this isn't just my fight, it's ours. For years, Mike has taken advantage of our trust, and it's time to hold him accountable." The crowd erupted in applause, and Sarah felt a surge of confidence. Over the next hour, she listened as one by one people shared their stories. A single mother recounted how she had drained her savings to pay for unnecessary repairs. An elderly man described being stranded on the side of the road after Mike's shop failed to fix an issue they had claimed to repair. Each story added weight to the collective outrage, and by the end of the night, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that they were united in their pursuit of justice. The meeting culminated in the creation of a formal coalition, the Community Consumer Protection Group. Their mission was to not only hold Mike accountable, but also to advocate for better protections against fraudulent business practices. Sarah was unanimously chosen as the group's leader, a role she accepted with equal parts pride and humility. As the weeks went on, the coalition's efforts began to bear fruit. They filed a class action lawsuit against Mike, backed by dozens of victims who had come forward with evidence. The local news continued to cover the story, keeping the pressure on Mike and his dwindling customer base. Meanwhile, Sarah and her team worked tirelessly to educate the community about their rights as consumers, hosting workshops, and distributing informational pamphlets. But the fight wasn't without its challenges. Mike's legal team tried every trick in the book to discredit Sarah and the coalition. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the testimonies were biased, and that Mike's business practices were standard in the industry. At one point, they even attempted to paint Sarah as a disgruntled customer with a personal vendetta. Despite the setbacks, Sarah refused to back down. With Lisa's meticulous record-keeping and George's expertise, they countered every argument with facts and evidence. The support from the community only strengthened their resolve, reminding Sarah that she wasn't alone in this battle. As the legal proceedings dragged on, an unexpected twist emerged. A former employee of Mike's shop came forward, offering to testify against him. The man, who had worked as a junior mechanic for several years, revealed that Mike had pressured his staff to inflate repair costs and perform unnecessary work. He provided detailed accounts of how Mike had coached them to manipulate customers, even going so far as to create fake invoices for repairs that were never done. The whistleblower's testimony was a turning point. It added a new layer of credibility to the coalition's case and exposed the systemic nature of Mike's fraud. The community rallied around him, praising his courage for coming forward despite the risks. Finally, after months of legal battles and public scrutiny, the case went to trial. Sarah sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding as the judge read the verdict. The coalition had won. Mike was found guilty of multiple counts of fraud and ordered to pay restitution to his victims. His business license was revoked, and he faced additional penalties for his deceptive practices. The courtroom erupted in cheers, and Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face. She had fought not just for herself, but for an entire community, and the victory was sweeter than she could have ever imagined. In the weeks that followed, the coalition continued its work, advocating for stricter regulations and increased transparency in the auto repair industry. Sarah, once an ordinary woman who had doubted her ability to make a difference, became a symbol of resilience and justice. Her story inspired others to stand up against wrongdoing, proving that even the smallest voices can create ripples of change. As she stood before the coalition at their next meeting, Sarah reflected on how far they had come. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's the beginning of something bigger. Together, we can build a community where honesty and integrity prevail. Thank you for believing in this fight, and in each other." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt a sense of peace. She had faced fear, doubt, and adversity, but she had emerged stronger, not just for herself, but for everyone she had fought for. And as she walked out into the crisp evening air, she knew this was only the start of a new chapter, one where justice wasn't just a dream, but a reality worth fighting for. The aftermath of the trial brought a strange mix of relief and exhaustion to Sarah's life. For months, she had been at the center of a battle that felt larger than herself, and now that it was over, the quiet felt almost disorienting. The courtroom victory against Mike's auto repair shop was monumental, not just for her, but for the entire community. However, as the dust settled, Sarah realized the fight had left her with more questions than answers about the nature of justice, community, and resilience. In the days following the verdict, Sarah couldn't walk down the street without someone stopping to thank her. At the grocery store, the cashier smiled and said, "You're Sarah, right? Thank you for what you did. My dad was one of Mike's customers. He always felt something was off, but didn't know how to prove it." At first, the recognition felt overwhelming. Sarah had never sought the spotlight, and being the face of a community-wide movement was a role she wasn't entirely comfortable with. But as the days turned into weeks, she began to embrace it. People weren't just thanking her. They were sharing their own stories of overcoming injustice, or expressing how her actions had inspired them to speak up in their own lives. Yet, not everyone was supportive. On a particularly quiet afternoon, Sarah was at home tidying up when her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a comment on one of the coalition's social media posts, a long, scathing message accusing her of destroying a small business and ruining a man's life. The commenter claimed that Mike had been under financial pressure and was just trying to make ends meet. Sarah stared at the comment, her chest tightening. For a moment, she felt the familiar pang of self-doubt creeping in. Had she gone too far? Had she truly ruined someone's life? She thought about Mike's smug demeanor, his refusal to admit fault even when confronted with overwhelming evidence, and the stories of countless victims who had suffered because of his greed. The memories of those moments hardened her resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Later that evening, she met with Lisa and George at her kitchen table. They had become her closest allies during the ordeal, and their presence was a constant source of comfort. George sipped his coffee and leaned back in his chair. "Let me guess. Someone's blaming you for holding Mike accountable." Sarah nodded, sliding her phone across the table to show them the comment. Lisa skimmed it and snorted. Typical. When people don't have a strong argument, they resort to emotional manipulation. Don't let this get to you. It's not just this one comment, Sarah admitted. I've heard whispers around town. Some people think I overstepped. They say Mike should have been given a chance to fix things without it going public. George set down his cup with a decisive thud. Sarah, you gave him every chance to do the right thing. He didn't just make a mistake. He built a business on deceiving people. And as for ruining his life, he did that himself. You didn't force him to scam anyone. Lisa nodded in agreement. Besides, the impact of what you've done goes far beyond Mike. You've set a precedent. People are more aware now. They're less likely to fall for scams because of what you exposed. Sarah sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. You're right. It's just, I never expected this to be so complicated. Winning the trial felt like the end. But it's not, is it? Lisa shook her head. No, it's not. Change is messy. But the important thing is that you didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for everyone. And you won't always get unanimous support, but the people who matter know the truth. The conversation reignited Sarah's determination. If there were still people doubting her intentions, she would show them the broader impact of what they had accomplished. The coalition was stronger than ever, and Sarah wanted to ensure their momentum didn't fade now that the trial was over. The first step was addressing a new problem that had emerged in the wake of Mike's downfall. Several former customers who had relied on his shop for affordable basic repairs were now left without a trusted mechanic. While Mike's fraudulent practices had been exposed, not everyone in town had the resources to seek repairs elsewhere. Sarah knew that for the community to truly heal, they needed more than justice. They needed solutions. At the next coalition meeting, she presented her idea. We've done an incredible job bringing attention to the issue of fraudulent mechanics, she began, addressing the group of nearly 50 members. But now we need to think about what comes next. There's a gap in our community, and we have an opportunity to fill it. What if we created a network of trusted, vetted mechanics? A place where people can go without fear of being taken advantage of. The room buzzed with excitement as members began brainstorming. George offered to help vet mechanics, using his decades of experience to identify trustworthy professionals. Lisa suggested partnering with local nonprofits to offer financial assistance for low-income families needing urgent repairs. Another member proposed creating an online resource where residents could leave reviews and share their experiences. Within weeks, the coalition's efforts began to take shape. They launched a website called Fairfix, which listed local mechanics who had undergone a rigorous vetting process. The site included transparency ratings, estimated pricing for common repairs, and a section for customer reviews. Sarah and the team worked tirelessly to promote the platform, hosting workshops and community events to educate people about their rights as consumers. As Fairfix gained traction, the coalition began to receive recognition beyond their small town. A regional newspaper ran a feature on their work, calling them a blueprint for grassroots consumer advocacy. Sarah was invited to speak at a nearby university about her journey, sharing insights on how ordinary people could create extraordinary change. But even as the coalition celebrated these successes, Sarah found herself reflecting on the personal toll the fight had taken. One evening, as she tucked Emma into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, are you still fighting that bad man?" Sarah smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's forehead. "Not exactly. We made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. But now I'm trying to make things better for everyone." Emma nodded solemnly, her expression thoughtful. "I think you're like a superhero. Not with powers, but with bravery." The words brought tears to Sarah's eyes. In the whirlwind of the trial and its aftermath, she had sometimes worried that her fight had taken too much time and energy away from her daughter. Hearing Emma's words reminded her why she had started this journey in the first place, to create a better, fairer world for the people she loved. As the months passed, the coalition continued to thrive. The town had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. People were more vigilant about where they took their cars, and discussions about consumer rights became a regular topic at town hall meetings. The coalition even began expanding its mission, tackling issues like predatory payday lenders and unethical landlords. For Sarah, The journey had been transformative. She had stepped into a role she never imagined for herself, driven by a sense of purpose that went beyond her own experiences. And while the road had been fraught with challenges, she knew it had been worth it. One crisp autumn evening, as she stood outside the community center after another successful coalition meeting, Sarah looked up at the stars. The air was filled with the distant hum of crickets, and the sky stretched wide and endless above her. She thought about how far she had come. From a single mother who had simply wanted her car fixed to a leader who had inspired an entire community to stand up for what was right. As she walked to her car, she felt a deep sense of peace. The fight wasn't over. There would always be new challenges, new injustices to tackle. But Sarah knew she wasn't alone. She had a community behind her, a group of people who believed in the power of collective action. And as long as they stood together, there was nothing they couldn't achieve. Months had passed since the coalition's victory in court, and life in the small town had settled into a new rhythm. For many, the scandal surrounding Mike's auto repair shop was now a cautionary tale, a story people told over coffee to warn others about the dangers of blind trust. But for Sarah, it was far more than that. It was a turning point, not just in her life, but in the life of the community. And though the battle had been won, the ripples of change it set into motion continued to grow in unexpected ways. Sarah's days were busier than ever. Fairfix, the consumer advocacy platform she had helped create, had expanded far beyond their original vision. What began as a small network of vetted mechanics had blossomed into a hub for transparent, ethical business practices across multiple industries. Local plumbers, electricians, and even contractors had started to join, each agreeing to abide by a strict code of conduct. The platform's success brought an influx of requests from neighboring towns, and Sarah found herself juggling meetings with local leaders, community organizations, and even small business owners who wanted to replicate the model. Despite her hectic schedule, Sarah made it a point to stay connected to her roots. Every week, she hosted open forums at the community center, inviting residents to share their concerns and ideas. These meetings often turned into lively discussions, with people brainstorming solutions to everything from potholes to housing issues. Sarah loved seeing the way the town had come alive with a spirit of collaboration. It reminded her that the fight against Mike had been about more than exposing one bad actor. It had been about empowering people to demand better. But as the coalition's influence grew, so did the challenges. One afternoon, Sarah received a call from Lisa, whose voice carried a note of urgency. "We've got a problem," Lisa said. "There's a group of businesses pushing back against Fairfix. They're claiming it's unfair competition and that we're hurting small businesses." Sarah frowned, leaning back in her chair. Unfair competition. All we're doing is promoting transparency and accountability. How is that a bad thing? They're saying we're creating a monopoly on trust. Lisa replied, her tone tinged with frustration. They're trying to paint us as gatekeepers who are favoring certain businesses over others. The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it revealed the depth of resistance to change. Sarah knew that Fairfix's growing influence had disrupted the status quo, and not everyone welcomed that. But she also knew that backing down wasn't an option. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings and negotiations. Sarah and the coalition worked tirelessly to address the concerns of local businesses while staying true to their mission. They hosted workshops to help businesses meet Fairfix's standards and created an appeals process for those who felt unfairly excluded. Slowly but surely, they began to rebuild trust with skeptics, though the process was far from easy. Amid these challenges, Sarah found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed. She thought back to the quiet, unassuming woman she had been before her confrontation with Mike, and it almost felt like another lifetime. That version of herself would never have imagined leading a movement or sparking a town-wide transformation. Yet here she was, a leader, an advocate, and a voice for justice. The journey hadn't been without its sacrifices, long nights, personal doubts, and moments of overwhelming pressure, but it had also been deeply fulfilling. One evening, as she was going through paperwork in her kitchen, Emma walked in holding a crumpled piece of paper. "Mommy, we had to write about our heroes in school today," she said, her voice shy but excited. "I picked you." Sarah's heart swelled as she unfolded the paper and read Emma's carefully written words. "My mommy is my hero because she helps people. She fought against someone who was doing bad things, and she made our town better. She's brave and smart, and she never gives up." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she pulled Emma into a hug. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more to me than you'll ever know." Emma beamed up at her. "Are you going to keep helping people?" Sarah smiled, stroking her daughter's hair. "As long as I can." That promise became even more important when an unexpected twist brought a new challenge to Sarah's doorstep. One afternoon, she received a call from Elena, the reporter who had helped expose Mike. "Sarah, I've been digging into something, and I think you need to hear this," Elena began. "It turns out Mike wasn't working alone. There's a network of repair shops across the state using the same tactics. I've got documents linking them to a bigger organization." The revelation left Sarah stunned. She had thought the fight ended with Mike, but it seemed the problem ran much deeper than she had imagined. As Elena outlined the evidence she had uncovered, Sarah felt a familiar surge of determination. This wasn't just about one dishonest mechanic. It was about systemic corruption that exploited countless people. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and a coalition partnered with Elena to investigate the broader network of fraudulent businesses. They collected testimonies, analyzed financial records, and worked with legal experts to build a case. The scale of the corruption was staggering, and it became clear that their small-town victory was just the tip of the iceberg. The fight against this larger network brought new challenges. The opposition was better resourced, with lawyers and PR teams who worked tirelessly to discredit the coalition's efforts. But Sarah had learned a thing or two about resilience, and she wasn't about to back down. She rallied the community, leveraging the same grassroots energy that had brought them together before. People organized protests, shared their stories in the media, and demanded accountability from local officials. The momentum grew, and soon the coalition's efforts caught the attention of state regulators. A formal investigation was launched, and the fraudulent network began to unravel. For Sarah, it was a vindication of everything they had fought for. A reminder that even the smallest voices could make a difference when they refused to be silenced. In the aftermath of the investigation, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at a statewide consumer rights conference. As she looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a mix of pride and humility. "What we accomplished in our town wasn't just about exposing one bad actor," she began. "It was about proving that ordinary people can create extraordinary change. And while the fight isn't over, I believe we've shown that when we stand together, we're unstoppable." The crowd erupted in applause, and Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had started this journey as an ordinary woman looking for justice, but along the way, she had found a purpose far greater than herself. And as she stepped off the stage, she knew that the fight for fairness, integrity, and accountability would continue, not just in her town, but everywhere her story reached.